I'm Mark Seifter.
I'm Linda Zeiss Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark. Welcome, everyone, to GM Tools Worldbuilding 101. Tonight, we're going to start talking about what you do when you've decided, I'm going to build a world. And that's quite possibly all that you know. Is I'm going to build a world. We're not going to set it in Paizo's Golarion or the Forgotten Realm from Dungeons and Dragons or any of those other pre-published settings. Instead, you are going to build your own new world. So when you get started on building a world, you have to think about what is the most important part about this new world that you're going to build. What's most important to you about it? And there's two basic ways to go about this very, very first question of why did you decide to build a world instead of using one that was pre-made. The basic ways to do this are the same as the basic types of design in computer programming or game design or a lot of other types of design. They are top-down or bottom-up. So, a bottom-up design, a bottom-up reason for creating a world is you wanted something that was all yours, all new details, and you're building it around sort of the area where the PCs are interacting with it, and you're basing it maybe off of what your players say that they want. Oh, they want to be cat folk and rat folk and bat folk. So you make an area that has lots of cat folk and rat folk and bat folk.
And here you're going to have more of a sense of what you want those very initial adventures to be right from the very start, because building around those very first things that your players want to do is going to help you decide what is going to be that first town that they begin in. What is going to be that those first organizations that you need to know who they are.
Or maybe you know that your first adventure is about an undead uprising from the graveyard in a town. And so that's where you start with. This is all from bottom up. You have some details, and then after they deal with the undead, you're like, okay, an undead uprising. So there might be, are people sending those undead? Do they just happen on their own in this setting? Are there any priests or clergy that might want to help against the undead? What deity is that? And then you start building the deities and other organizations as you need them, expanding out from that town into probably the kingdom where that town is, outward from there. That's bottom up.
For bottom up, I find that it works well to have an area that's relatively isolated, so that you don't have to try to figure out all of its major interactions, either wilderness area or a small town that
or a frontier.
Doesn't have to, yeah, exactly. Or to have the PCs be people who are from out of town, so that they're not expected to have a large, broad base of knowledge, so that there's no particular need to do a big info dump right at the beginning.
Absolutely.
To help them feel like they can play their characters accurately.
So there's some pros of bottom up, particularly is that if you're building from bottom up, you can keep with a very important principle of design. It's sometimes known as lazy evaluation in computer programming. It's also sometimes known in those very old dungeon magazines as like I want to say the first or the 0th rule of dungeon craft, which is don't build too much detail, more than you actually need, of all sorts of things that are never going to come up. Bottom up approach can help with that, because you only build things as you need them or are about to need them. That's the advantage. One of the disadvantages is that it can be hodgepodge because of the fact that you've literally only built the deity you needed for that undead uprising, and you don't know how they fit into the pantheon. And as you make things along the way, they might not fit together seamlessly. So also, sometimes just having the details from the bottom-up approach does not lead to a cohesive whole, or might not take you anywhere. So, but the advantage is it hooks in the details you want and the first story you want to tell, and it's easy to add on without creating way too much and wasting your time. The opposite is top-down. From top-down, you start with something big principle. Like, there was one world for a setting in a homebrew game that I run only with Linda. And in that setting, one of the most important things from a top-down perspective is that power, great power leads also to great restriction on the character. The more powerful you are, the more restricted you are in any of a number of different ways, and those restrictions can make it hard for you to do things exactly the way you want them. You become a little different, and there are things that you have to do. And that theme is part of the top-down build. Because top-down, you start with themes, you start with big picture, you start with some of the most important top-level, that's why it's top-down, top-level facts about your world, why you want to tell the story there, what's important about the story. Another thing that was important about that setting is that it's a dark fantasy setting, which in bottom up, you might not know that it's a dark fantasy setting. You just know undead were attacking that town, and it turns out it's gothic horror later, or it's survival horror, or it's actually comedy. You're not really sure. But when I was building that world, that somewhat top down, but somewhat bottom up. But I had some top down ideas, but then I also didn't bother with more than one continent worth, plus a little bit on another continent.
Yeah.
Just because I didn't want to go too out of control building things that I wouldn't need for a while.
And we have another world that we've kind of slowly started to build a little bit in the background, where we started with things. We started with, like, okay, what is the nature of magic in this world, and how does that, and how do different nations relate to the fundamental expressions of magic?
That's
and
right.
How is that going to, and what are some of the major organizations and groups? What are the ancestries that are most prevalent in this world? And what are some of the major cultural movements for each nation?
That's a great example. So it's a top-down build. It all starts with how magic works, and that also leads to new ancestries, because the way magic works in that setting is sort of, if you think of it in like concentric spheres, there's the magic of the natural world and the material building blocks, like things that are around. It's like nature magic. It's similar to Primal from Pathfinder 2nd Edition, right? But then outside of that is the mental sphere, and that has magic of the mind, and outside of that is the spiritual realm, and that has magic of the spirit, and beyond that is
void,
void
is like really messed up, and
the beyond is just not part of the normal nomenclature of things, and it's not part of the settings sort of ontology, but sometimes things come through all of those layers, and they pass from the beyond in, and those are sort of like these weird aberrant things.
And it's not necessarily coming from the beyond is going to destroy you, like sort of Lovecraftian theme, but the idea is that
it's just very different.
It's very different, and you in certain concepts like higher levels of higher dimensionalities. The fundamental nature of time, the fundamental nature of infinity, things like that are associated with void, because basically the idea is that the farther removed something is, the harder it is to understand, and because most of the ancestries that you might possibly play in that setting are tied and rooted into nature, fundamentally void is just too far out, just like things that are fundamentally tied into void wouldn't really be able to understand beings of nature.
And so based on that magic system, we immediately came up with several nations, one of which follows that path of the spheres from inner to outer, talking to the spirits that embody each of those things, kind of like shamans, expanding their recognition and understanding and trying to stay in harmony with it. One of those paths just sort of embodies, like an avatar, a particular spirit into their own body, and those can become almost god kings that are often from the spiritual realm, the most powerful outer sphere. One of them is like, what are you doing with all of these spirits and magic? We're not going to do that. And then there's another one that's more like, we bind things into constructs and just, we're not going to treat with these creatures. We're just going to use them. And what you're doing is weird. And so all of them really don't like each other for a variety of reasons, and they find certain actions that the other people take in the other kingdoms to be repugnant.
And we
Also,
use kingdom as a generic term. We also
yeah,
know
they're
they
not
have
all
different
kingdoms.
governmental systems.
They do have
and things
different
like that, but
governmental systems. They're different countries. That's a
Yes.
better way.
Mhm.
Nations.
Yes.
Nations. That's a better way to put it across.
Mm-hmm.
So
But that was something where we thought about, like, what's the magic system, and then we realized that because the spirits are essentially the divine forces, the sources of power, and magic is so significant to this world that divisions on fundamentally how to see magic would be a major cultural divider.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was sort of a top-down approach to finding out more about the proximal areas of that world, and it also created new ancestries like the doppelgangers, which are beings that came from the void and are trying to be like things from this world. They're doing their best. They're possibly the most comprehensible things that came from the void. So there's all sorts of ideas that you can come up with when you have a strong idea for top-down.
Yeah.
There are some weaknesses with top-down, though.
But I mean, a few things to mention from that. We had, like, the culture, we had the magic system, we had the religious system, we had political conflict, we had nations, we had governmental systems, and we also had a sense of where your character is going to start in that world as well, and some basic traditions.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So
What I was gonna say about top down is it has a strength in that it can create very strong cohesive themes, and you'll have an answer for something when somebody asks about it if it has to do with those top level facts about the world and the pantheons and so on. But it has several weaknesses, one of which is if you don't have a strong enough idea from the top, it's not necessarily going to inspire you to fill things out like our magic system did in that particular world. And second, it can wind up taking you a ton of time. Like those stereotypical things you hear about someone who's a world builder who has this giant binder with 500 sheets of paper about their setting that they haven't run yet. They're top-down builders in general. So you need to make sure, if you do build top-down, to be careful to understand the strengths of bottom-up and use bottom-up aspects to your top-down design, where you come up with the most important things top-down and then build a little bit bottom-up instead of building entirely top-down.
I mean, even if you're looking at something like Golarion, when Golarion came out, it was like, okay, here's the Inner Sea World Guide, and we'll talk about other areas of the world later. We're not going to go into that much detail of every single place in the setting, and that's a very detailed setting book. But even that didn't try to define the entire world. It lowers
the oculus that you're looking at.
Yeah.
It's still pretty darn detailed.
Yeah, so that's going to be more than what you would want to do just for a home campaign. But I'm trying to say that even that didn't define the entire world at once.
Absolutely.
So taking a look at sort of the broad sketch details of some of the aspects of the world, and then picking a smaller area where you know your PCs are going to be playing around in to do more focused is still a good idea when doing top-down design.
Oh, and Mentalic Mutant basically said what I was about to say in the chat. Mentalic Mutant said, building top-down is like building a model city or train set. Folks who do that likely enjoy that as much or more than actually using it in a campaign. So my tip, which is similar to what Mentalic Mutant said that I was about to say, is when you do build top-down, like we had a cool magic system because we have game designers and developers who can come up with in-game magic systems. You should consider when you're building top-down that whatever your strength is, whatever's the thing you like, are you great at building campaign map? That's good because I'm terrible at it. But if you are a detailed campaign map, or if you love history and you want to do figure out the rough strokes of 1,000 years of the geopolitical history of your setting, or whatever it is that excites you and that is your passion, you can actually focus on that when you're going top down, and you will tend to do better if the thing that you're focused on is the thing you're passionate about, and that you'll be happy having created no matter what. Because that is going to be vibrant, and it's going to ramify outward from the top down in a much better way than if you force yourself, if you're like, I have to do it by a map, and I'm terrible at maps, but it's going to be a map, and that's where we're going to start.
Kitsune Warlock has some, shall we say, questionable advice. The key to effective world building is to spend decades detailing a single village down to the most mundane minutia, just so your players can run off into the woods to never again visit again after the second session.
Yeah, so don't do that. That would be on, whatever that... Isn't there a Twitter account of, like, bad advice for role-playing games? That would go on there. That is absolutely what you don't do. And Nicole suggests the key is to make NPCs your PCs fall in love with and make them the monster. That's a good example of something similar to that, but in plot design. But in world building, what you're really looking at is going after the entire world, either from the top down or bottom up, your choice, depending on your situation and what matters to you and your group. You might want to have your group help you with the top down. If you're not good at a map, but you can explain it, and one of your players is, maybe they could help. That's an advantage, because top down has another disadvantage if you do it all by yourself, which is that you do this whole thing and you're like, and catfolk only exist in legends, and then your player is like, my character is named Neko, and I am a catfolk, and I only play catfolk, and otherwise I will not play, because I only play catfolk. But they only exist in legends. Look, I wrote a 700-page thesis on why the catfolk disappeared. That will be invalidated by catfolk. Neko, 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 neko. So, if you don't... the problem with top-down, actually, it can happen with bottom-up, but it's much less likely, is that you do this whole thing, and then your players just don't care, or don't read it, or just want to do something else. So, at least try to hear a little bit about your players' desires, or even bring them in with you world-building. It can be a lot of fun.
So if there's particular things that they want to have out of the world,
Rico says, Mark's troll players make me appreciate my friends.
Yes, for sure.
Here at Arcane Mark, we make it so that you just love and appreciate your friends, because isn't it all about friendship and community?
But yeah, if your players want a particular thing out of the setting, asking them up front so that you can be sure to build that in, because you have the power to do whatever. Yeah, so let's see.
Mentalic Mutant suggests maybe if you build bottom up, but with a couple things for plot hooks, like magic is illegal or the gods have abandoned us, you can then go top down when you know which things the players like. That is definitely true. It's sort of a... it's sort of how some people who are showrunners on some TV shows do it, where they kind of don't know what's going on, and they're like, you can do anything as long as it doesn't actually retcon away what we've already said in the show. So, if you can do that literally on a TV show and get away with it, it can work well for you when you're building a world for your RPG. So once you've decided whether it's top-down or bottom-up, you're going to drastically fork and do different things at this point. So let's talk a little bit about certain things that you're going to want to do no matter what. So you're going to want to know about certain aspects of either... should we split it to top-down and bottom-up?
I think we should.
Okay. So if you're going top-down... You definitely want to know, at least in the area that the PCs are going to be interacting with, whether that's the inner sea or that continent that I said that I made in my dark fantasy world, or those 4 neighboring nations and the one that Linda was talking about with the different kinds of magic. Set your stakes, set your stage, determine what the overall geography is. You don't have to be a great map guard. You can just say the Kingdom of Westphalia is to the west of the Kingdom of Eastphalia.
Have some general sense of the climate and of sort of the climate and the broad features, so that you have a sense of, like, are there mountains?
There are mountains.
How do people get their water? And how does the and some very basics of how the economy works is useful. Like, you don't have to know, like, oh well, this town trades for this thing with this town, unless you're like trying to do Spice and Wolf the game. It doesn't matter.
But you could know at least some basic facts. Like, in high school, I made a world, and There's a nation called Folderia. They were on the leeward side of a mountain, so they were in a desert. There's also magical reasons that the desert got worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And their entire economy was based on knowledge, lore, and information rather than gold or other coins. So sages were held in the highest possible regard in magic, other than divine magic, because they got kind of messed up by some priest kings a while in the past, and they don't like them. So magic other than divine magic is most treasured, which means the sage of magical knowledge was the most important person in the entire nation. Which, of course, is why the PC wizard went up to him, the sage of magical knowledge, and then just started insulting him for no reason, calling him like a worthless sack. Which was kind of interesting.
He had a pretty serious case of PC-itis, didn't he?
Yes, he did. And he just didn't care about the facts that, like, the party cleric told him about, like, I have to hide the fact that I'm a cleric because they hate clerics here and they prize these other things. He just didn't pay attention or care, and he just insulted the Sage of Magical Knowledge for no reason. So the Sage of Magical Knowledge cursed him with some curses that would mess up his spells for a short time, and then had a first-level apprentice challenge the high-level PC to a spell duel, but the PC lost because he was cursed, and then everyone laughed at him.
I mean, he deserved it.
He did. So you've got to figure out what is the basic idea for your general overall environment, climate, what the situation is in the areas that you're going to be playing at when you're going from top down. Also, what technology level is it? Like, a lot of these fantasy worlds are just some kind of medieval to Renaissance-ish. But does it really make sense? Because we've got Renaissance-only things here and medieval limitations there.
And also we have magic, so how does that work?
And we also have magic. Sometimes you have something that's even more completely makes absolutely no sense. Like, we have guns, but they haven't spread around for some reason, and neither have they advanced for 100 years, like in Golarion, where they've had guns for like 100 years, and they're the same guns that they had 100 years ago. So you have to decide what your tech levels are, and whether...
I think that it makes a lot more sense with what happens in Numeria, where it's just like, this is
no one
so
can
far
reproduce
beyond
this, 'cause it's way
anything
far beyond.
that you can't reproduce it.
Yep. So you have to decide how much you actually care about the technology level, like, being at all consistent. And the answer is, unless you're someone like me who just cares about those kinds of things, you shouldn't. Because you clearly can be, like, published as one of the best published settings in the world and not care about that. And because players don't really care about that unless they are the one person who's like, wait a minute, the technology level. But you should at least figure out roughly what you want to do with it, right? If it has cell phones, but your players think that the rapier is the most modern invention that it has, then it's going to be confusing when after 12 sessions, it's like, how do the villains always keep knowing about us before we get there? It's like, well, they use their cell phones to send each other a text. Like, why have you not been doing that? What? Thou dost not have this witchery.
Yeah, unless the I mean, there can be certainly adventures where the point is that is a vast contrast in means of technology and magic.
Oh,
and stuff
sure,
like that.
but
like,
it's a problem if you think that the world has cell phones and none of your players knew that, and you never communicate.
Yeah, but I'm saying making sure that everybody understands sort of like where the world is at and what kind of resources are going to be available to them, as well as sort of how they can what they can expect their general place in that world to be.
So the next thing for top down, I'm realizing more that with bottom up, you just build the details you need. We'll get to that in a few minutes. But the next thing with top down that you want to know is magic. Magic, which includes, if you're in Pathfinder, there's, you know, four traditions and these essences that build it. But how does magic work in your world? Deities are probably connected to this, but they may just be their own thing in your setting.
If your setting has deities.
If they even have them. But these are two interconnected questions that you're going to have to answer in your setting. So, for example, in the setting that I made, that was the first one that Linda ever played, which is different than any of the ones we've talked about so far, there were deities. They lived in an sort of an alternate reality that you could not access via plane shift called the realm of the immortals, that only a deity could enter, including someone who ascended to deityhood could enter it and would enter it at that point, and not even a deity could ever leave.
Mm-hmm.
But they could have some limited effects on the world from there. And that was sort of how the deities worked. And they had a pact that they wouldn't mess with the energy of the unborn souls. That was violated, not by the gods of evil or the god of death or something like that, but by the goddess of peace, love, and healing, when she saw a huge calamity that was going to tear apart the world, and she just was like, stop! And she used some of that energy to try to temporarily create a peace, and it destroyed her and created this horrific cataclysmic area that technically separated two warring nations that were using different kinds of magic, and no one wants to cross it because the devil worshippers who tried to cross it lost 75% of their army when they did that. So it worked. Didn't work. I don't know.
Consequences for sure.
You can decide. In that world, also, there were a lot of weird things about how different magic worked as well. So, like, divine magic required a holy relic, which towns were founded around if they were immobile before you could get your spells back, because the gods were in the realm of the immortals. Humans could not cast arcane magic unless they made a contract with devils who had taught how to use diabolical magic, which was basically arcane, etc. So, however magic works in your world, when you're going top-down, you should figure it out. And your answer could just be Pathfinder baseline.
And I think it's also important to consider that there are certain spells that make a bigger difference on the world than others. Like teleportation magic, for example. The ability to travel quickly from area to area is definitely going to be very relevant in world building if your PCs are going to have access to that.
Well, that's an amazing point, which pivots...
Healing magic.
That pivots to a tool that we give you in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that did not exist as much before. And teleportation and healing are good ones on this. Rarity. So, when you're world building, you don't necessarily have to do something weird like I was doing where I messed around with all the basic rules of the game. But you could just change the rarity, right? You could say teleportation's common. Or it doesn't exist. You could say healing magic's rare. Even the spell heal. Cleric class doesn't get that for free. You can drastically change the world by just changing the rarity and expectations of certain magic.
And divination magic as well as sort of the related but non-magical point of how accessible is information in your world makes a huge difference. Because if you're playing in a modern setting where people have access to the internet versus a setting where you know, there isn't magic and there isn't technological communication, and people are trying to decipher things from ancient tomes that may or may not be accurate because people don't really know as many things nowadays since there's been a cataclysm or things like that. That's going to make a huge difference to how your setting plays.
Yep.
So the access to and reliability of information is really important.
That's right. And going back to rarity and spells, classes. Wizard might be rare or unknown in your setting as a class. What if champion is rare? Because deities rarely give someone that much power, and so if your player comes in as a paladin, everyone in the city is like, whoa! Because there's like 10 of those for this entire deity in the world, or something like that.
So then that's a lot more like everyone's looking at you, and you'll both draw admirers, and you'll draw admirers, people seeking help, and also people who want to destroy you because they don't like what you stand for.
In the dark fantasy setting that I used as an example a few times, one of the three PCs, main PCs, is the only person in the world who has his class. Which... that's really rare.
Yes.
The other two are a fighter and a witch, but that one guy is just this weird heretical ex-cardinal. And he has a class that nobody else has. And that's part of the setting and why the church is after the witch and the heretic, and the fighter was like I don't know what I'm doing with these people, but then he wound up more heretical than anyone.
Yep.
It's great.
Bad influences.
You're blaming the other characters for Frederick?
No,
that's your fault.
Everything Frederick did is my fault, and I am not sorry. Anyway,
and you want to know when you're building top down a little bit about all the nations that are nearby and changing the way that the world works. You don't need to know every nation in the entire world, even when you're building from top down, but the ones that matter to the part of the world and the part of the story that you're telling. You can come up with some of the top level details about those nations like Linda and I did when we told you about those 4 nations in the world using that new kind of magic that we were talking about earlier in the episode. So those are all different things. Plus, once you've decided how the gods work, even if there are not any real gods, I think we have a lot of evidence that whether or not they're real gods, a world is going to have religions. So think about what religions are common in your world. You don't necessarily have to create 100 different imperial lords. You can probably keep it a little more basic, but make sure that you're at least covering all the bases that like every real world religion has. And sometimes you can miss out on that if you are just trying to do the gamey version of a pantheon. Like I think the 3rd edition example pantheon just didn't have any fertility or love deity in it because there was one for each alignment and one for each character class, and that didn't give a love or fertility deity. And all real world pantheons have one. So instead of trying to match out what your alignments or your classes are when you're doing it from top down, make sure you have ones that match what pantheons that would be built by your the cultures that are around, and then maybe ones that are a good match for your players if you know about them.
And it's also worth in that thinking about the prevalence of monotheism versus people worshiping various pantheons and things like that in your world. Because that'll have a big impact too on how people interact with the divine. Absolutely.
And you might need to know about the cosmology of the planes and other things beyond your world. Like I talked about the realm of the immortals in one of my settings just a little earlier. You might not care. It doesn't necessarily matter. As long as you kind of know, oh, there are devils. I don't care where they are from yet. I'll figure it out later.
Yeah.
Like, you don't necessarily have to go into such detail as being like, well, the devils and demons are, this is again the dark fantasy world, are both from a place called the Pit that's really horrible, but the devils live in these sort of domes that kind of block off some of the really bad and painful, like, torture effects of being in the Pit, which causes them to be a lot more sort of someone you can talk to, whereas the demons are just very in pain and very much are going to lash out at you no matter what. And, of course, this leads to a situation where the domes only have a limited amount of magic, and everybody has to prove their worth or they get kicked out and become a demon. So, oh boy. You don't have to go into that much detail. You just know there are devils and demons, and that could be enough.
But you didn't necessarily know that much detail until it became clear that, like... No, you would have because of some of the other things, but, like...
I knew some of that pretty early on in the setting, or in the campaign, because of the importance of the 13 archdevils to the story of Gaius and some of the other characters.
That makes sense.
But anyway,
I was starting to say you might not have known that, and then I realized no, you would have based on.
That's true.
Knowing that's another advantage of top-down design is it makes it a lot easier to draw foreshadowing into your campaign.
Oh yes, all the foreshadowing. You can't really foreshadow unless you just figure out that you set yourself up for something that looks like foreshadowing when you're using bottom up. But it's a lot of work.
Also, if your players start audibly speculating about foreshadowing, feel free to bite those hooks and build them out.
Then it really looks like you foreshadowed like a champ. So let's go back down to bottom up, because we're not going to get into nitty gritty. We're just going to give you the 101 for top down. These are the kind of things you have to think about. And you might think about something else like economy. Linda said Spice and Wolf RPG setting. Economy might be your top thing and that you're really into, and who trades what, imports and exports. that might be entirely what drives your campaign and your story, and that's something you might want to set up. Whatever is important to you and that you like and enjoy when you're going top down, you might as well incorporate that in. So, bottom up. Like we said at the beginning, get your PC's buy-in, or your players' buy-in, rather.
Yes.
Almost immediately for bottom up, if you can, because, well, you're building from these little nitty-gritty details up to your plot. So if you don't know the correct nitty-gritty details, you're gonna mess up.
Yeah, and you'll want to know. You want to set. Working together with your players to set certain parameters for what their characters are going to be. Now, this could be coming more from you or more from them or from a mix of both. It doesn't really necessarily matter. As long as you are on the same page about things like what is your character's level, what is their general power level, what kind of place is this set in, and what sorts of things sorts of things are they trying to do. So that you don't have a situation where someone comes in and is like, but I'm going to be a catfolk.
Yep.
And you've built an adventure.
Neko.
Yes, you've built an adventure that is about trying to uncover facts about the long lost culture of the catfolk who used to live in this area.
Yep, and that's the entire campaign. It's like, why are the catfolk gone? What happened to them? Yeah. There are no catfolk. If we only had one to study on, we would not need to do any of these adventures. Neko. But more, like, to give an example, we've talked in previous episodes about a time that I ran a game where everybody rolled up some random tropes by creating random page on TV tropes and built character concepts. And then I built characters and a setting. Literally, it wound up in a fairy tale setting, and if you've heard the story about it, you know it's in a fairy tale setting. But I didn't know that until after, like, 3 of the players wound up with fairy tale seeming characters based on the tropes that they got. And I was like, okay, well, it's a fairy tale setting then. One of them wasn't even, like, that good of a fit for the fairy tale setting because of the tropes that he got, which were that he was, like, this sort of, like, very supportive. He had the Colonel Badass trope, which is the trope about colonels are the best because they're the highest rank that can go into, that actually goes into the field. So in every show, they're going to be the ones who are super heroic. And then he had, like, the team attack one. So I gave him weird team combinations with the other players who did not know that they had them.
Yes.
But he wasn't exactly the perfect fit, but 3 of the people were. So I made a fairy tale world, and I made sure that his character was, like, the colonel of the armies of the kings of the fairy tale world. And he was like, oh yeah, that's fine. Like, he saw that the other ones were actually fairy tale characters.
And then we had, like, all of these, like, Chrono Trigger style.
Yep. And the way I did it, too, because it was, like, about unlocking them and not knowing, is that I just told him what 3 weapons he needed to do the triple attack, or 2 weapons. And some of the characters didn't know that they had those weapons because one person didn't know what any of their moveset was, and another person was Cinderella, and she refused to accept. She just wanted to actually clean her house and not go on adventures, but her fairy godmother was like, hey, listen, go on a quest. And she refused to accept the buffs that the fairy godmother was trying to give her. And eventually, when she did, she got one of the types of weapons that the colonel needed for his combos. Whereas the X-Strike, which is always the starting one, that he could do with Linda's character, was one that they figured out right away.
Yes.
Anyway, the point is that you could probably make a world bottom-up that fits any kind of weird characters. In that case, there were no constraints other than they were random up on TV tropes. They could have been, like, from any genre.
Yes. But still,
usually there'll be a little more constrained
making sure that you have some way to make them all fit together into the same story. So, I mean, that worked because we just needed to tweak one of those to fit into the genre. But if you have someone who's like, my character concept is, I want to be the very best necromancer. And the other person's like, my character concept is, necromancers are the worst, and I would like to go on a quest to destroy all undead. Then, like, those are not going to work together in the same party.
Yes.
So make sure that you at least establish enough in the beginning that you're not going to have that kind of situation where the PC's goals are diametrically opposed.
And you might not even necessarily have something that's that trollish, right? Imagine these two. These are completely reasonable, I think. Person 1 says, I've been inspired by the game Monster Hunter.
Mm-hmm.
My character is going to go out there and kill those monsters we find, skin them, and make use that those sort of scales and other parts to make new magic items or other items for themselves and the party to get stronger so that we can fight stronger monsters. Right? That's not a troll.
Yes.
It's not a usually problem character. The second one is like, my character is a redeemer of the goddess of redemption who believes that anything can be redeemed and wants to befriend and generally make our help make this world a better place for everyone. And help defend people from these monsters, but also see if the monsters can see reason. Which is like a pretty normal character that you might want to play. Both of those two might be like a little extreme in their ways, but they're going to be a big problem because the Monster Hunter player is not going to get those scales if you don't kill the monsters.
Yeah.
And the Redeemer person is definitely going to be really upset if you wind up redeeming them and the Monster Hunter's like, but they have the exact kind of scale I need for these boots, so I'm killing them. So, this is a group dynamic question. It's not really a world building question as much that we've gotten into. But when you're going bottom up, you could possibly find a way to build a world that even can satisfy these weird constraints. So, for example, you can create a world that has different kinds of monsters' ancestries that don't get along, but that maybe someone could help them get along. But then, there's a breach into another reality, and these weird beings that are from those outside reality, they're made up of these rare ingredients from other dimensions that you can't get otherwise, are breaching into the world. They're mutating and destroying the environments and causing problems for all the different monsters' ancestries, and they are anathema to the world itself. Their very presence there is dangerous to it. So even the Redeemer can say, okay, well, we better get rid of these.
Yeah. Maybe the first time they encounter them, the Redeemer tries to be like,
I'll
let's talk to
redeem
them.
you.
And then it's like, oh, no, they're actually...
Whereas the crafter is like, these ingredients don't exist anywhere in our world. Are they dangerous to the world? And you'd be like, no, only their animating soul and spirit corrupts the world. These are not dangerous to the world, but they're great at fighting against these people if you put it in your weapons and armor.
But then the person who worships the Redeemer and wants people to get along more might be taking point more on trying to set up trade agreements with all sorts of other people who
or
live
even
there in
defensive
the world.
agreements
Or
against
defensive
these
agreements
new
against,
incursions of like, come on, lizard, lizard friends. Like, I know we've been the humans and the lizards have been at war in the past, but we need to work together against these weird things that are coming in to attack us all.
Yeah.
And so that's something that and then the Monster Hunters, like, plus lizard people don't have great armor, but these creatures are dropping all these good stuff. They can just agree to work together on that.
Or like you befriend the spider people and then they sell you some of their silk or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a way with bottom up, once you know what your players want, to sort of use the constraints to build what you're doing. Another one of the advantages of bottom up is restrictions breed creativity. With top-down, our tips for 101 were to try to give you some restrictions based on the things that you like and lock those in. With bottom-up, you're going to get them because you're going to find some details and they're going to lock you in, and then you're going to have to find a way around some of the conflicts in those details.
So, what if I'm building a setting bottom-up and I find that I have painted myself into a corner?
Uh-oh.
So like... I was building a bottom up and I built a few pieces and they're kind of contradictory and they don't really fit.
Well, you can try to come up with a third thing that makes them work together, but it's possible that you just can't. Right? It's possible that all cat folk have been gone for 5,000 years and the entire story is about finding about the cat folk, and if you found even one cat folk, it would just ruin the entire thing because then you would just ask them or study their body. And that also, Melvin, the cat folk juggler, was juggling at a tavern in another session. But right before you told everybody that, it's like, but wait, last session didn't we meet Melvin, the cat folk juggler?
I would say that, yeah.
It's possible that you've done that.
So in some cases, you can like retcon smaller details.
Say, oh yeah, Melvin was a rat folk. I messed up. Or actually, Melvin was a minx folk. It's related to the cat folk. It's not the same thing. Melvin was a human who has a little bit of catfolk ancestry and who dresses up like a catfolk because of those ancient legends.
Mm-hmm.
Or some, you can come up with some kind of minor retcon around it, but you're gonna have to think of something if it's literally contradictory like that.
Yeah, and in some cases, if you've been exploring this setting in more of a one-shot fashion, which is something you can certainly do while building out a top-down thing, you might consider if some of the adventures were set in a different time period from others.
Mm-hmm.
Or were set from a different perspective, or were set sort of, or set from a different worldview, and then the exploring those seeming contradictions is part of what becomes more interesting. Like, people in this, it was like, why do people in this country say that catfolk have been lost, and people in this country say say that we live among the catfolk? Or those catfolk in country B, far on the other side of the ocean, the same catfolk that people in country A can't find, or are they doppelgangers or some other thing?
People in country B are all dog folk, and they consider the human to be cat folk because they're more like cats than they are. So they just call humans cat folk because they're the most cat-like thing that's around.
But I mean, I find that
they're cat folk because they like cats, and the dog folk all don't like them. So that you're a cat person, and then that got sort of condensed into cat folk.
Yes. Well, I think that players are generally really understanding when there needs to be a slight retcon to make things make sense. So rather than hiding when there's a discrepancy, which can then just cause more confusion, just being like, hey, there's this discrepancy here.
I'm sorry, I was building the world as we went along. I messed up on the cat folk thing.
Mm-hmm. Or sometimes you just have to kind of say, like, okay, let's not zoom in too much on this particular detail because this is kind of contradictory, and let's move on.
Yes. I mean, you might have to do that in a published adventure. There's definitely some, as I mentioned in my Jade Regent stories that you can see in the Mark's Adventures Jade Regent, there's like a timeline skip between what the early books of Jade Regent want the timeline to be on the big plot of the place that you go at the end, and what the later books think that the timeline is on that same plot that is off by a couple decades. And if you just don't pay attention to it too much, all the things that happened in the story are super cool, and you can just do it. But they definitely don't line up.
But then the players know not to, like, waste time trying to understand things about the world by zooming into that discrepancy.
Right.
But just to know, that's a little bit of a discrepancy, and we're going to move past that.
Mm-hmm. So I think that gives the basics for what to do in both the top-down and bottom-up situation. We explained what top-down and bottom-up are. We explained the advantages and disadvantages of top-down and bottom-up, and some of the first steps you need to take depending on whether you're building top-down and bottom-up. And best of all, and most important of all, you need to focus around your players if you have them at the time that you're doing this, or yourself. What excites you? Bring in the players if you want, and have them build certain parts of it too to help out. Get them really engaged. With those tips, you're going to find that it's much easier to start building a new world, can be more fun, and that you will build fewer things that turn out to be irrelevant later on.
Yeah. One more thing on top-down. I mean, conflict is really the engine of storytelling, so when you're building a top-down setting, defining where some of those big conflict points are up front, because those are going to be complete gold mines of story.
Like the 4 nations we created all don't like each other for different reasons.
So whether it's national conflict, organizational conflict, philosophical conflict, cultural conflict, conflict over limited resources.
Or the world where the goddess of peace caused that huge explosion has 2 giant superpower, either a sort of group of nations and one really big nation empire fighting against each other. But if you have a world where it's like everyone's at peace and there are no monsters and they just like each other and it's friendship, then it's going to be harder to tell stories. That doesn't mean that you can't, but it's a lot easier to tell them if you have conflict. Because in any good story, in any good TV show, book, game, improv, or play, it's all about conflict or negotiation or just some way that 2 goals clash against each other.
And, even if you're setting up a world where it's like Yeah, the sort of classic, it starts in a time of peace, and then the PCs are there right when things start to go wrong. Setting up how things are peaceful and then how things are going to transform in the immediate future.
Right. Start with this is normal. And maybe there's tensions the PCs know about.
Yeah.
And then, boom, the tensions shoot off. All right. So that should get you started with building your world. And I hope you enjoy building a world if you were here and were about to build a world, or that you enjoyed hearing about these tips, even if you weren't going to build a world, in thinking about worlds that other people build and thinking about, did they build them in this way, or how did they build them? Anything else for people, Linda?
No, that sounds good to
All
me
right.
for a 101.
Let's say bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye!
All right, Twitch friends. Let's quickly